Being perfect is often in conflict with being complete or finished or done. Let's talk about that on the podcast today. It's Saturday. I'm on my way to the office. This is the Saturday Morning Hustle. And that's right. I'm in the car driving to the office. This is something I used to do when the podcast was brand new, when I only had the Anchor app, the free 5-minute version of Anchor. And I'm doing that again today. A little bit of going back in time, a little bit of a flashback here to following up from our flashback episode from last week, because it dovetails into this concept of not having to be perfect in everything you do at all times. There are times when it's perfectly smart, perfectly acceptable, a really good idea to be good or good enough or complete enough in order to put something into the world. And there are times when you need something to be as perfect as it can be. There's no such thing as absolute perfection in the world. We're all mortal, but as good as it possibly can be, really taking your time, pouring through something, developing as much as you can before putting it into the world. There's a balance there. And we talk about balance a lot in this podcast and the special series of balance as well. But this is a prime example. When you need something to be perfect, it's something that's big, huge investment, something that really represents you. It's typically something that is associated with a brand or something at that level of performance. Branding is a great example of something where you have to definitely take your time, do as much due diligence as possible, do as much testing, do market research, do all those things necessary in order to get to a point where you feel extremely strong about the high level of work and execution you put into something like branding or developing a flagship product for your business. You need to do as much work as possible there to get it right, because there's so much writing on that. There's so much value in it. There's so much investment you're going to make in it. And then when you launch it into the world, you need people to be able to immediately see the value, understand it, etc., relate it back to you, etc. That's all comes with being as close to perfect as possible. But there are so many other things, so much execution. And I think a podcast is a great example that you simply need it in the world. You need it to be good enough. You need it to have enough value with it. It needs to be cohesive. It needs to make sense. It needs to be something that has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has value in what you're delivering. It creates value for the listener. If it's a podcast, you hear the car. I'm driving right now, and the car's telling me to put my seatbelt on, which I haven't done. But it's not perfect. And that's a great example right there. I was just interrupted by the beeping of the vehicle telling me that I don't have my seatbelt on. And I apologize for those of you mad at me for not doing that right now. It's a whole different story. This is being recorded on my smartphone in the car while I drive. It's not going to sound nearly as good as the normal podcast I do in my fully hooked up podcast studio, my dead space with beautiful microphones and a professional recorder and all digital products and a script and notes and everything that I often do for the Saturday Morning Hustle. This episode right here, this episode today, is not going to have the same audio quality as that type of podcast. But if I caught you at the right time with that opening statement, with the headline, with the title of this episode, if what I'm telling you now, that it's okay to do certain things to perfection and there's okay to do things less than perfect because there's value in getting it in the world, getting feedback, going through the work process. If that helps you today, then this podcast has created value for you. And thus, just because it doesn't sound perfect, it's a good idea to do it this way. I'll probably go back to doing those perfect podcasts, maybe next week or the next time that you listen to this podcast. It may sound just a little bit better in audio quality, and I won't be interrupted by the ding of the car or if someone runs a red light or the sound of the road as we go by. Hopefully no one honks a horn or anything crazy at me like that. But the content is what's important. It's a podcast. It's Saturday morning. It's timely. It's motivation. It's connection. It's inspiration. I'm also looking for feedback from you. All the time I ask you on this podcast to provide me feedback, to hit me up on social media, to send me an email, to go to the website. All of those things where I could find out if the topic made sense to you, if you appreciated what I said, if you disagree with me and wanted to even have a debate, which I welcome as well, because more different viewpoints that we can have in a conversation might be beneficial for people. All of that is a good thing. All of that is welcome. All of that can be, and typically in a podcast scenario, is probably more important than having perfect audio quality and a perfect cohesive script that an AI bot could have wrote. We're not doing that, are we? We're making it up as we go. I have 0 notes today outside of that initial idea. One single concept to talk to you about today is perfection is the enemy of good enough, about balancing when you need to put more work in and when you need to get something out there, and understanding that often something that's maybe 50% of what it should be put into the real world with real world feedback, with real information from consumers or someone who is an end user or someone who would maybe spend their time or money on it, can be more valuable than any sort of research and developments you could do undercover to get it perfect before you put it out there. That's the point I hope you catch today. I definitely want to continue to get your feedback on what you think about this idea. I want your feedback on if this was okay to do the podcast like this, or should I go back into the podcast studio and make it sound just a little bit better? And the whole point of that too, and I'm not trying to say that you should start a podcast that sounds like trash, or because it can be hard to hear if you don't do it correctly. I've obviously done hundreds of episodes of podcasts. This podcast, my business podcast. I produce podcasts for other people's businesses. I do have a pretty good idea of how to project into this smartphone. I'm holding it close to my face. I'm driving carefully. Don't you worry. I've got the other hand on the wheel. I am paying attention. I'm on a very untraveled road, so I don't have a lot of traffic here this morning. But it's different than doing it in a studio. Doing it in the studio, using the professional microphones, even some of the other tricks that I use to make sure it sounds as good as possible when I deliver it to you, is so that it's easier for you to listen to, so that hopefully you can listen to it more. There's nothing more interrupting than having screech and pops and kicks and lots of ums and ahs and all those things that come with people who aren't proficient at making a podcast or don't have the technical capabilities. But I'm telling you right now, it's better to have a podcast off a free app on your smartphone that sounds good but not perfect. If your content is good, if your intentions are good, if you're providing value to the listener, than to not have it at all because you think you need hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment. It's not true at all, but there are hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars of equipment you can get to create a better podcast, but you got to start somewhere. This podcast, the Saturday Morning Hustle podcast, started a social media post and smartphone videos, and then moved into the smartphone app, the Anchor app, which I'm using today, and I still use a great product. You guys, if you're considering podcasts, go check that thing out. But it was free. It was 5 minutes at the time. Now it's unlimited. We're in 9 minutes now and doing well. Thank you, Anchor, for continually developing this product. But it started off as a free product. It started off me sitting in the car, driving to work, sitting in my office, before I understood, if I knew enough about what I was talking about, if I was a natural podcaster, if I could develop an audience, if I could listen to you and gain feedback from you and my audience, if I could create something that had some synergy with the people listening, the people consuming it, that was good for them and good for me at the same time, if I could figure all that out during the process while it was happening, then I could commit more time. I could commit more energy. I commit more financial backing to do such a thing and make it more of a commitment. And that's how I've ended up with over 300 episodes of the Saturday Morning Hustle. Is I did it quick and dirty. I did it in a most basic format. I learned some lessons. I experimented. I received some feedback. I utilized that feedback. I tried to make myself better by what people appreciated, didn't appreciate about what I was doing, etc. And now your typical podcast that comes out of the studio has a beautiful sound and great content. And I use my script, really notes, not necessarily a script, to make sure I cover enough points that provide information for you, feedback for you, value for you as the listener each and every week, and something I can manage along with everything else I do in my life. There's balance there as well. So there you go, balance. So as I have now pulled up to the office, I'm ready to go in and start my Saturday, but I wanted to have this brief conversation with you. I wanted to experiment with going back to the Anchor app, doing it in the drive-thru, see if there's any value in this more spontaneous version than what we've been doing recently. And I'm going to take your input. I'm going to, again, balance these things out and decide how to move forward in the future, because the other thing that you can do, the other way that you can create success for yourself and value for other people is listening to what people tell you and make those adjustments and have more connection, deeper relations, etc., because you put it out in the world, because you didn't wait till it was perfect. It was good enough to be valuable enough to people to pay attention. Then you were open-minded to the idea that you would listen to their feedback, you would see what episodes are ranked the highest, which ones get the most plays, etc., and figure out that place, that balancing act where you're capable of producing on a consistent basis and people are capable of consuming with value on a consistent basis as well. So that's the lesson today. So I'm in the office, time to go. I'll talk to you again next week.